Oh, I like your background.
Thank you. Well, welcome. Welcome. Uh, I think we're going to have a wonderful evening this evening. My name is Georgia Court. I'm the proprietor at Bookstore One in Sarasota, and I think we're going to have an interesting talk this evening with our guest author, Craig Pittman. But before we get going, I'm just going to give you a few hints about what we plan to happen tonight. First of all, I have put a link in the chat that should have gone to everyone. And that link shows you, or it gives you a link directly to buy Craig's book. I think most of, or many of you who are on this call probably have already bought it. But if you'd like another copy, it makes a great gift, particularly for people who are really interested in Florida, because it's a really good book. Anyway, there's a link directly to purchase the book. We are going to be using chat to ask questions. So there's a chat box, at least on my computer, is kind of at the bottom of the screen. It looks like a cartoon bubble. So use that to type your questions into. And as we go on, I'll be monitoring those questions. And then after Craig is finished speaking, we will take the questions one at a time and get through as many as we possibly can. So first I'm going to introduce Craig, and then I'm going to kind of disappear while I take notes on the questions that you ask. So you can just keep them coming if you like throughout the presentation. Craig Pittman is a native Floridian. He graduated from Troy State University in Alabama, where his muckraking work for the student paper prompted an agitated dean to label him the most destructive force on campus. All right.
He didn't mean it as a compliment either, to my surprise.
I know. I was a journalism major also, so I appreciate that, though. That's a good thing, though. Okay. Since then, he has covered a variety of newspaper beats and quite a few natural disasters, including hurricanes, wildfires, and the Florida legislature. Until quite recently, he covered environmental issues for Florida's largest newspaper, the Tampa Bay Times, winning state and national awards. He is the author of 5 books, including The Scent of Scandal, Greed, Betrayal, and the World's Most Beautiful Orchid, which also is a fabulous book. I recommend that one highly as well. And it's the only book that was ever classified as true crime gardening. And he's written...
Which shelf do you put it on?
Right. Interesting. Well, the interesting thing about something like that, Craig, now that you bring it up, is we would probably give it a special place on a table, which is even better because we know where to shelve it.
My evil plan worked.
Right. And he's also the author of Oh, Florida, How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country, which won the gold medal for Florida nonfiction from the Florida Book Awards. Please welcome Craig Pittman.
Hi, how are you guys doing tonight? You doing okay? You made it to the end of the week. Here we are on Friday night. And so thanks for joining me to talk a little bit about books and specifically about this book, Cattail, The Wild, Weird Battle to Save the Florida Panther. And I love this cover. This was not the cover I had in mind when I first sent it to the publisher, but I just love the fact that the panther is kind of rolling its eyes at my name just above its head. I thought that was kind of appropriate. This book was a labor of love, emphasis on the labor part. I spent about 20 years writing stories about environmental issues in Florida, and that means I wrote a lot of stories about the Florida Panther and the efforts to save the panther. And every time I would write one, I'd think, this would make a great book if I had an ending. There are fascinating characters involved, the plot twists and turns, and you can't predict which way it's going to go. But with no ending, how can I possibly write a book about it? So about 4 years ago, something happened where I said that would make a good ending. That would make not necessarily a happy ending, but a hopeful ending. And so I sat down and started pulling together the book proposal, that we ended up sending out to quite a few book publishers, most of whom said, wow, this sounds fascinating, but we just don't think people will read a book about Florida. And so finally, one of them said, Hanover Square said, this is great, we love it, we're going to run with it. So thank heavens they published it, and it's getting to readers, and people are telling me they like it. I'm not one of those authors who gets up and reads for like an hour. I was just going to read just a couple of pages in the book just to give you some flavor of it, in case you had not read it yet. The book opens with a prologue titled Cat Under Glass. And so that's where I'm going to start. The panther ran as fast as it could. The dogs gave chase, plowing through the underbrush, howling with delight. This was what they were bred to do, to sniff out and chase down big cats like this one. Their master, the tall man in the cowboy hat, would be pleased. The female panther they pursued was a scrawny thing, seriously underweight. It wasn't strong enough to keep the chase going long. Finally, it leaped onto a tree trunk and clawed its way up onto a branch, then stopped to look down. The dogs circled the trunk, panting, their eyes trained on their quarry up above. Then the cat heard more noises approaching, a group of humans, all but one of them men. One of the men climbed partway up the tree with a gun. Then he raised it and fired. The cat flinched. The dart hit it in the leg, and everything went dark. Then the cat was falling. When it hit the ground, it didn't move again. One of the men, and then the lone woman, bent over it. They put their lips on the panther's hairy mouth, blowing their breath into its lungs, trying to revive it with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. They were too late. You can find the most important Florida panther that ever lived in a glass case in the R.A. Gray building in downtown Tallahassee. It's just a couple of floors up from a towering mastodon skeleton named Herman that's on display in the Museum of Florida History. Tallahassee is not the place you'd ever expect to see a panther. It's too far north, for one thing. For another, it's home to two colleges and their football teams, whose fans pack the place on the weekends. Panthers prefer solitude. Sometimes they don't even like to be around other panthers. Plus, it's Florida's state capital, its seat of government. That means that instead of cypress trees and wild palms and thick stands of palmetto, you've got lots of marble office buildings and sidewalks and pavement and parking garages. The Gray building looks pretty much like its name, sitting 2 blocks down from Florida's remarkably phallic Capitol building, just past the far more dignified Florida Supreme Court. The museum is low-key but impressive, what with the mastodon skeleton and other displays about Florida history. But all that's downstairs. To see the panther, you've got to ride the elevator up to the state archives, where it sits just outside the entrance. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a statue. Not a very good statue, mind you. It looked like one made by an enthusiastic but unskilled amateur working with inferior materials. I figured that was why it was sitting up there all the way away from the other, more professional-looking exhibits. But not until later did I realize that this had been an actual panther, a 70-pound female that once prowled South Florida's swamps and forests, its shoulders rolling like the waves on the ocean, its tail twitching restlessly, its topaz eyes open wide to detect any movement in the surrounding darkness. Now it was stuffed and mounted, its limbs stiff, its eyes glass. In different places in the Western Hemisphere, this animal goes by different names. It's all one species, puma, but it's been called a cougar, a mountain lion, a catamount, even a tiger. It has adapted itself to live in a staggering variety of habitats, from desert scrub to tropical rainforest to the Hollywood sign looming high above Los Angeles. Because this one's in Florida, it's known as a panther, a Florida panther. This cat under glass isn't just some random ratty bit of taxidermy. It's actually Florida's official state animal. And for a time, it looked like this one would be among the last. So we go on from there and kind of talk about the perceptions of the early explorers when they encountered panthers. There's a story about an early settler who was being pursued by a panther and decided to distract it by removing her clothing as she ran. Ultimately, we come to the part where the State Game Commission, as it was then known, now the Wildlife Commission, became alarmed that they thought it was going away. It was almost extinct, and they finally told people to stop hunting it. That was in 1958. And then in 1981, Florida school children actually selected it as our official state animal, which was really, in a way, you could argue is what saved it, because if it was not our official state animal, I don't think politicians would have paid nearly as much attention to try and bringing it back from extinction. Ultimately in the early 80s, as a result of that, the state started sending scientists out to study them and figure out, where they lived and what they ate and that kind of thing. And that led to the discovery of what was wrong with them and what was needed to be done to bring them back from from dwindling down. And by 1995, there were no more than about 20, and some people think there were even fewer than that. And now, not to give away the ending, but now we've got about 200 wandering around in our wilderness, what's left of our wilderness here, which is very good news indeed. There are some great characters in this book. One in particular, I mentioned the guy in the cowboy hat. His name's Roy McBride. Roy is like the movie character Zelig. Whenever something important happens involving Panthers, Roy just happened to be there. He actually performs one particularly important function in the book, and it's in the chapter that's probably the bleakest chapter of all, called Hail Mary, where scientists have decided that the only way to save the panther is to attempt this unprecedented experiment, so they have dispatched Roy to Texas, and Roy had never told this story before about what he did in Texas, and when he told it, he actually had me on the floor. I was laughing so hard. So that's actually, in addition to being the bleakest chapter, is also the funniest chapter in the book. It involves him blindfolding a mule while he goes to look for Texas cougars, and it gets wilder from there. One of the themes in the book, and I didn't say it, I didn't hang a lantern on it or anything, but one of the themes in the book is women in the sciences. The women took the lead often in trying to save the panther, and that led them to clash with their male bosses and male politicians and so forth, who just didn't believe what they were saying, but in the end they were proved to be right. I hope you guys, when you read the book, you'll take away from it that scientists are very human, and that they don't always agree with each other, and ultimately it's up to science to work out who's right and who's on the right trail and who's not. I tried to really humanize it. I mean, in a way, you could say this whole book is about genetics, which sounds just so boring your eyes would roll out of your head. But by telling these human stories as well as the stories of the animal, I was hoping to try to make it more like a novel, more like something you would read in fiction, but it's all true, every bit of it. I guess I can answer questions if you guys have any. Somebody, by the way, had asked me where I'm from. I'm actually from Pensacola originally. That's where I was born. My parents are from the Panhandle originally. One of my great uncles actually traced our family tree back to 1850, the first one to come down here. Apparently, he was looking for a good price on waterfront condos when he arrived, and we've been here ever since, and very much a Florida family. I think I realized we were not necessarily like people in other states. I was going to my grandmother's funeral, and I was in the limo with two of my cousins who both had mullets and were chewing tobacco, and they actually got into a fist fight in the limo on the way to the graveyard. So.
Well, I have asked everyone to unmute. So if you want to ask your questions live, you can do that, because I haven't gotten any questions through the chat. So
I think I saw one. I think somebody just submitted one.
Okay, let me see if I can find that one. All right.
It was something about the election.
Oh yeah. Do you think, this is from Sandy Ripberger, do you think the election could have any impact on the big cypress development you wrote about in the Phoenix?
Yes. I do a weekly column on environmental issues for the Florida Phoenix, which is an online news organization based in Tallahassee. And I recently did a column about how President Trump signed an executive order, as he often does, that that would. I'm sorry. Do you know where that?
I think yes. I think.
There we go. Thank
Peter,
you.
Peter Rausch, I have just muted you because there was extreme. There was some strange
A lot of
noise.
static. There was a lot of static.
On your line. If you want to try unmuting again.
Anyway, he had signed this executive order to basically put a fast forward on legal review of a lot of different proposed developments that might go against environmental rules. And one of the ones on that list was, according to the Department of the Interior, was this proposed development in Big Cypress National Preserve area, which is where a lot of panthers still live. And so the concern was that this is one of the real threats to panthers. And
so sorry. Okay.
That's okay. This is one of the threats that panthers face. The other big one, of course, is the proposed toll road through that area that has been backed by Governor DeSantis. It was originally part of this package of bills that that Senate President Bill Galvano, who I believe is from Bradenton, had put forward, saying we need to build these roads. And he came up with that idea after getting a campaign contribution from the Florida Road Builders Association. Those two are big threats to their habitat, because one of the toll roads would actually go through the heart of panther habitat. And of course, it's not just the road, but all the development that it would bring with it as well.
Can you tell Craig you're hungry?
Yes.
Hi, Charlie.
Hey, Craig.
Well, this is what happens when everyone is unmuted, right? Hello, Charlie.
Charlie Husking and I used to work together at the Sarasota Herald Tribune 30 years ago.
And I haven't gotten tired of you yet. I still eagerly await every visit.
Yes.
Yeah, I love Sarasota. While I worked at the Sarasota Herald Tribune, that's where I actually started dating the woman who's now my wife. So I have very fond feelings towards Sarasota.
And we have another question, by the way. I recently saw another Zoom chat. This is Mark Robachek, that talked about how panthers were imported from elsewhere to restore the Florida population. Does your book discuss this effort in great detail? Okay, Craig.
Yes, yes, that was what Roy McBride was doing in Texas. They had reached the point where everything you would normally do to save an endangered species was not working. And so no one had never tried this particular approach before of bringing in a related type of animal and attempting to crossbreed the two. There were legal questions, there were scientific questions, and finally they said, well, we don't really have any other alternatives. This is the only thing we can do. And so they dispatched Roy to Texas to capture some female Texas cougars and bring them back to Florida and turn them loose and hope that they would mate with the remaining male panthers before it got to be too late. And so yeah, that's sort of the heart of the book, is how they got to the point of realizing this is our only option, is to do this thing that nobody's ever done before, and then how that played out, and then the ramifications of it, because once you start bringing back panthers start filling up places in the map they didn't used to be, and that led to a lot of conflicts as well. So yeah, that's definitely something that is discussed at length in the book, and it sort of spurred me to write it in the first place, is that that they had done something that no scientist had ever even attempted before, and in fact, the last bird species to go extinct in America was one here in Florida. It was a not the grasshopper sparrow. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It was a very small type of sparrow that lived in Central Florida, and its habitat was largely wiped out by Disney's development as well as NASA developing. And so they decided one of the sort of the last ditch things you do to save an endangered species is to try captive breeding, to try and capture some of the remaining members of that species and bring them into captivity and then try and breed them there. And then you can release the young, back into the wild. Well, they went to capture the remaining ones of these sparrows, and there were only 3 left, and they were all male.
Oh, geez.
And so there was some discussion about, should we bring in cousins? Should we bring in sparrow species that are like this one but aren't exactly like it? And ultimately, the decision was made not to do it because nobody had ever done it before, and there were legal ramifications. And as a result, the last one of those sparrows actually died at Disney World in 1987, and the species was gone, never to come back.
Yeah. Well, we have a question from Peter Rausch. You mentioned some
Peter.
feedback. You mentioned some feedback you got about your treatment in the book about Mayer, pronouncing that
Yes.
name, who was
Dave Mayer.
the villain of the piece, I suppose. Can you elaborate or update us on that situation?
Yeah, Dave Mayer is a real crucial figure in the book. Dave, there comes a point where, well, after that Panther is killed, and in the thing I just read you guys, the whole Panther science program was put in doubt. There were calls to end it completely. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas said, "Please leave those poor Panthers alone to die in peace. Stop bothering them to put radio collars on them." And the guy who was the head of the program was ousted and told never again go south of Gainesville, basically. When Dave was brought in to head up the sort of the rest of what was left of the Panther science program, he worked very long and very hard to restore its reputation and bring it back to a level of respectability and even some popularity by writing about it, by giving lots of speeches about it, telling people about the work they were doing and so forth. And there came a point where because Dave was very full of himself, Dave often clashed with his bosses. And so there came a point where he was sort of pushed out, and 2 weeks later showed up working for developers and helping them get permits to build in Panther habitat, and ended up writing what was the most influential paper about Panther's use of habitat that developers would then use to get permits. And it turned out that a lot of that paper was based on bad science. He had taken 40% of the data that he was using for this paper and thrown it out because it didn't match his theories. And there were other problems as well. And so when the book came out, now I should mention Dave is dead. He died in a plane crash in 2008, so I couldn't interview him. But I did my best to sort of reconstruct his thinking on things. So, that included reading a book he wrote on Panthers, reading everything else he wrote about Panthers, reading all of the interviews he gave. I went over his personnel records from the state and talked to his former coworkers of his and his former boss. And fortunately for me, he had sat down and given a lengthy interview to a graduate student who was doing a paper about Panther science. And the graduate student gave me the transcript to read over and said, "You can use 3 quotes." That's all, just 3 quotes. So that all helped me to sort of flesh out who he was and what he did and what his, sort of his good and bad reputation there. When the book came out, people who still think very highly of Dave got very upset with my depiction of him in there. They did not want to hear about things he did that helped developers. They didn't believe it. And they said that I did him a disservice and did a disservice to his memory. But I have to tell you, I went above and beyond the call of duty, really, as far as trying to tell people this is who he was. He wasn't all bad. He wasn't all good. Like most people are not all bad or all good. And it's not like I could have written the book and left him out by any means. So there you go. But there's been some pushback. There was a lot of social media flack from Dave's friends and so forth. And, I have to say, this is the most controversial book I've ever written as far as that goes, as far as the reception.
Or a Panther.
I'm sorry?
I think someone who has an audio on probably was commenting to someone else.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah.
Anyway, so I wouldn't say he's the only person who does bad things in there. There's another guy named Sam Hamilton, who's the head of the Atlanta office of the Fish and Wildlife Service, who was not exactly helpful to Panthers. And him I got to interview before he died, fortunately. So he gets to speak for himself in the book. It's there's a one of the heroes in the book is a guy named Andy Eller, who ended up blowing the whistle on his own agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for continuing to use Dave's junk science in approving permits. And he ended up losing his job, ending his career, but he just felt it was the right thing to do, to say, you're doing wrong by using this science, because this science is wrong and this science is bad. And, whenever people were saying, you have disgraced Dave Mayer's memory, I'm like, well, what about Andy Eller? Don't you think he deserves some consideration for what he sacrificed by pointing out the flaws? They don't really have an answer for that.
Interesting. Well, Marianne Harding has a kind of a slightly different question. You said that scientists don't always agree with each other.
Right.
Environmental NGOs often don't either. What is your perspective on the role they have played, good or bad, in saving the Florida panther? Full disclosure, I work for Defenders of Wildlife.
Okay, well, Laurie McDonald shows up in the book. You'll from Defenders of Wildlife. And I do point that out, that one of the big conflicts in the book is scientists like Dave Mayer, who argued that the big problem panthers face was the loss of habitat, versus the scientists who were saying, yeah, habitat's a problem, but first we got to fix their genetic defects. That's the big issue, and that's a more immediate threat. And there was a huge conflict over that. And ultimately, the genetic defects became so obvious they couldn't be ignored, and so they ended up having to deal with that. But yeah, there is definitely a frequent conflict between environmental groups. I've seen it year after year in Florida, where on the one side you have people who say, we're drawing a line in the sand and we will not let them pass beyond this, and other people who say, well, if we've tried drawing a line in the sand in the past and that doesn't work because the regulatory agencies don't help us, so we're going to try and cut the best deal we can and hope that works. And so there's sort of this push and pull, and I think it depends on the issue as to which one is the right approach and which one isn't. For instance, we just had a thing where a number of environmental groups were suing the federal government for allowing seismic testing off the Florida coast looking for oil. And they, instead of trying to cut a deal, they sued, and ultimately they won because they ran out the clock. The permits that they were challenging wound up expiring. But on the other hand, and I talk about this in the book, that they're Defenders of Wildlife and some other environmental groups were trying to cut a deal with a big developer in Collier County. It's the one I talked about before, to set aside land for panthers as part of the development, because they said we've learned we can't depend on the federal government and the regulators there to protect panther habitat the way they're supposed to. So we've got to get the best deal we can, which is, it's understandable and kind of a sad commentary on how our taxpayer funded agencies are working, or rather not working these days.
Well, they're working, but not for us.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah, that's right. A question from Melissa Schwartz. Have you ever seen a panther in the wild? And have you met people who have seen them? And I think your book explains that. And where do you see the most panthers in Florida?
Well, you see the most panthers in Florida on license plates, of course. There are far more panther license plates than there are panthers in Florida. I have seen 3 panthers. 2 were in captivity, and one was run over and unfortunately deceased. And that one was in Hillsborough County. It was the first one to show up there in 30 years, and died trying to cross the interstate there by the Lazy Days RV Center. The 2 that I saw in captivity, one was at Everglades Wonder Gardens in Bonita Springs, which ends up playing a fairly prominent role in the saving of panthers. And then the other one was at Zoo Tampa, where I went and was promoting my book on a TV show. They wanted to have a real life panther in the background, so that's where we went. I'm told that one of the best places to see panthers is in an area around the Corkscrew Swamp, Waxahachie Strand, sort of nexus down near Fort Myers and Naples. People have actually encountered a panther on the boardwalk at Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. And of course, the other great thing about if you go to Corkscrew Swamp is they also have the super ghost orchid, which if you've never seen a ghost orchid, this is like a ghost orchid on steroids, because most ghost orchids just put out one bloom, and the super ghost orchid, when I saw it, it had 6 on it, and it just kept on blooming and kept on blooming and kept on blooming. So that was pretty cool. Seeing a ghost orchid was on my Florida bucket list, and finally got to see one last year. I still have not seen a panther in the wild. I still would love to see that, but they're nocturnal. They don't like to be around people. They do their best to avoid people. So we have to put in a lot of extra effort in order to finally see one. Yes, I talked to a lot of people who have seen them, and just about begged on hands and knees for the Wildlife Commission's capture team to take me along with them when they were going out to capture panthers and put radio collars on them, and they would not do it. They were worried about the liability involved, unfortunately. I did go up in an airplane, though, with one of the biologists who was flying around checking the radio readings on the panthers down below. And he said, every now and then we see one. So, of course, I spent the whole flight peering out the window, but didn't get to see one that way either, unfortunately.
We have a question about how do you choose your topics of all the possible things you could write about with Florida? How do you decide which direction to go?
That's a good question. A lot of it depends on if it's something I've reported on before. For instance, with panthers, I did a big series for the Tampa Bay Times back in 2010 about the panthers, about their history, and about how they were saved, but this had begun posing new problems for them. And I did an awful lot of the reporting that wound up in the book in doing those stories. The one, Sin of Scandal, which is the one that's actually set there in Sarasota, is one where I covered the case for the Times and wrote several stories on it, and then wound up writing a story for Sarasota Magazine on the case once it was over. That case, by the way, is the one where Selby Gardens wound up facing criminal charges for wildlife smuggling because they took in the most spectacular orchid discovery in a century, and then it wound up getting in legal trouble. The one exception is Florida, which has sort of more of a tangled background. I was tweeting a lot of interesting Florida stories on my Twitter account, and then as the George Zimmerman trial was coming up for the shooting of Trayvon Martin, one of my Twitter followers was an editor at Slate, and she contacted me and said, how would you like to blog about Florida for a month while the Zimmerman trial is going on, and just sort of tell people, don't have a stereotype about Florida. It's weird, but other stuff goes on there too. So I got permission from my editors at the Times, and I did this month-long column about it. And of course, the problem wasn't coming up with things to say for 30 days. It was it was figuring out which ones, because I had way more material than I needed. So that was in 2013. Well, the following year, I got a call from an agent in New York saying, hey, we think that the presidential election year of 2016 would be a great time for a book about Florida to come out, and we think you're the guy to write it based on this blog that you did for Slate. And are you interested? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I'm trying to write up a book proposal on it now. Yes. So they sent me a template. I, wrote up a proposal, sent it to them. They sent it back. We went back and forth about 5 or 6 times. And then finally they said, okay, now we're good. And sent it around, and St. Martin's Press picked it up and ran with it. And it actually made the New York Times bestseller list, which was a nice surprise, under travel of all things, which I would never have expected, but whatever works. And and people really loved that book. And I was telling Georgia before we started, when I was touring in support of that book, people would come up to me at different events and tell me their Florida stories, and some of them were absolutely hysterical, and most of them I could never repeat. But my favorite one was the couple who told me about how they discovered that their new neighbor was running an illegal nudist bed and breakfast, and the way they found out was they gave their kids a trampoline for Christmas. Mom, guess what we saw?
That's great. Well, we've had, let's see, Mark Robichuk is asking, I think, I'm not sure if you mentioned this a little bit before. Have you begun working on your next book? And can you tell us what it's about, if so?
Yes, the next book, I've already sent the manuscript into the publisher. It's coming out next July. It's a collection of stories and columns that I've written over the past 30 years or so, and it's called The State You're In, Florida Men, Florida Women, and Other Wildlife. And it includes columns and stories I've written about people like the lady in the Villages who was arrested for shoplifting while dressed as a turkey. And when I asked her why, she said, it's Thanksgiving. Like, of course, people dress up as a turkey for Thanksgiving. I did one on this bold con man who was so bold, he actually convinced a judge to take a check in payment. And the check not only was a bad check, it was one that he had personally drawn the check. It wasn't issued by any bank or printed even. It was just a hand-drawn check, but he convinced the judge it was real, and he paid the judge for performing a marriage ceremony for him and another woman, even though he was already married to somebody else. So in other words, he committed a crime of passing a bad check in order to commit the crime of bigamy. And the victim was the judge, as well as his first wife. And then among the wildlife stories, one of them is on these two scientists who, there was a sort of a mythical creature in the Panhandle that people have been talking about seeing for years, the leopard eel, but nobody really believed it was real. And they actually stumbled on it and discovered it was a real thing, and then worked on their own time using their own money to actually verify the existence and, do all the things, check all the boxes you're supposed to do to actually officially identify a new species. And that one has a little postscript on it, because after the guy who first found one of these things, he put it into a Tupperware container to hang on to it so it wouldn't get away. And I put that in the story, and shortly after it ran, I got this very stiff letter from a New York patent attorney who said, my client at Tupperware is very upset that you used the term Tupperware, and we want to make sure it really was a Tupperware container, because otherwise you're in big trouble, young man. And I wrote them back and said, listen, I love Tupperware. It's a Florida product. They're based in Kissimmee. I love everything about Florida. I would never, ever try to slur the name of a Florida product like Tupperware. This really was a Tupperware container. He told me that. And I think you're missing a bet here. I think Tupperware should mount a whole new marketing campaign about, for scientists, saying, if you ever find a mythical species and you need something to keep them in, Tupperware is the container to use. I don't think they took me up on that idea for some reason.
Well, here's a question about style.
Okay.
Do you wear your great Florida themed shirts only during public events? And this is asked by Peter Rausch. Or do you wear these every day? I love the flamingos on this one.
Thank you. This one's my favorite one. My wife gave me this one. She has great taste in everything except husbands. I used to just wear them during book events, and I would wear them on Fridays at the office. And now that I'm not in an office anymore, I wear them 5 or 6 days a week, because I have so many that you don't have to choose from them. But I saved this one for special events like this particular occasion. So you guys should feel special. You got to see the pink flamingo shirt. So
yeah. I'm very honored. I love it. I love the pink flamingo shirt.
And it goes with my flamingo cup too. So
great. And here's a question from Charlie Husking. And I think we're veering into different territory now. How optimistic are you that Florida can pull off an uncontested election on November 3rd?
Oh, not at all. No, I have no faith at all. You guys probably heard the the voter registration computer system crashed Monday at the deadline where it was people were supposed to be signing in to register to vote, and it was the last minute, and the whole system crashed. And initially they blamed it on Ariana Grande because she had tweeted to her 7 million fans register to vote. So they said, well, that must be it. She's from Boca Raton. It must be her fault. But then they said, oh no, it was actually that we had some misconfigured servers. So that's when it crashed. So they ended up extending the deadline Tuesday to 7 o'clock, but they didn't tell anybody until midday. So, you know, who knows how many people missed out because of that. And so some voting rights groups sued the state to try and get the voter registration extended even further. And a judge this morning ruled against them because they did give the one extension. He said that at least they did that much. But he had this great line in this ruling that said, the court notes that when man set foot on the moon, the rocket took off from Florida, from Cape Canaveral. However, Florida seems incapable of running an election, which is not rocket science.
That's a great line.
It's a great line. I do a weekly author newsletter called Oh Florida, the newsletter, and I always have a Florida quote of the week. I think that one's going to be a Florida quote of the week.
That's a good one. And I have a question for you also. You know, you say that the ending of your book is hopeful, and I read it, and indeed it is. And I would assume you were writing this book a couple of years ago. That's just how these things go.
Yeah.
But how hopeful are you these days about the influence of developers on our state and what you're seeing here?
Well, there are two things that work here. One is developers have money. Money will always control politics, and will always have a very outsized influence, especially in Florida politics, because they make the campaign contributions. Like I was just saying about the toll roads. You know, the people who really want those toll roads built are the road builders. They gave a campaign contribution to the Florida Senate president, and voila, it becomes legislation. And even much to the shock of the Florida DOT, it's kind of a side note, but one of those toll roads, the one that's not going south through Panther habitat, is going north up to the Georgia state line. And so I called the people in Georgia, and I called the Georgia Department of Transportation and said, did you know about this? Did you know they're building this road up to your state line? And they were like, do what now? What is it Florida's doing? Nobody had told them. They were shocked. And they kind of argued that there was no need for it either. So on the one hand, yeah, what the money talks and in Florida politics. And on the other hand, though, and I think we started to see this with the 2010 oil spill, and even more strongly with that long, horrible red tide event we all had to deal with for, I think it was 18 months in 2016, 2017. People are realizing in Florida that in Florida, the environment is the economy. And if you screw up the environment, you're going to screw up the economy. And so that's become a big political issue, to the point where while Governor Scott was running for the U.S. Senate, he actually was heckled out of an appearance by people who kept calling him Red Tide Rick because they blamed him for setting up the conditions that caused the red tide thing. And one of the reasons Governor DeSantis got elected governor is he promised to do something about toxic algae blooms, and he appointed a committee to come up with options, and the committee's options get turned into legislation, which a lot of environmental groups say are actually worse than the laws that were on the books in the first place. So, but hey, he did something. He really did something. Not necessarily the right thing, but he promised to do something and he did it. So I guess the question we have to answer is, which is more important to us? Whether we want to leave the field of making these decisions to the people who have a lot of money and stand to profit from it, or if we, realizing that alterations to the environment will put our own lives and future at risk by, draining the water supply or tainting it in some way, by altering our beaches or making them unusable, by making our air unusable, that kind of thing. If we'll continue to pay attention to the issues and speak out about them. And I've been seeing an awful lot of people speaking out who maybe have never done so before. So that's kind of heartening. The one kind of scary thing is that we have about 900 new people moving into Florida every day. and they don't know the issues. They don't know the background. They don't know what's happened here before. And so it's kind of up to all of us to inform them and let them know what's going on. In fact, that's kind of the reason Chad Scott and I started our Welcome to Florida podcast. That's our target audience, is to tell people, welcome to Florida. Here are things you need to know about living here. We hide it in a container full of jokes and laughter, but we try and put some serious stuff in there as well.
Well, Laura Held wants to bring us back to the Panther idea.
Okay.
She says a couple of years ago, a resident in Palmer Ranch reported seeing a Florida panther. Would that have been possible, or was it likely a bobcat?
It's possible. Panthers, male panthers in particular, are very wide-ranging predators, and the males range further than the females, and the males have a stronger urge to roam because a young male does not want to fight with an older male for territory. So they're sort of impelled to strike out for new territory and go as far as they can. One male panther that was born in the Southwest Florida area down near Fort Myers actually made it all the way up to the across the Georgia state line before it was killed by a freaked out deer hunter. So they do travel. Like I said, the one I saw was one that had been run over in Hillsborough County. It was a young male, once again, trying to find a new territory for itself. One of the stories I did one of the first Panther stories I did for the Times, and it ends up being one of the later chapters in the book, is Panther 62, which was the first one with a radio collar that crossed over the Caloosahatchee River and started heading north in the state. And it hung around in the Disney World area for a while. It went over to Daytona Beach. It went back. It crossed I-4. It crossed US 27. Crossed all kind of highways before the battery finally gave out. And we don't know where it went after that. But they do travel a lot. The females do not. They generally don't go more than about 3 miles from where they were raised. So that has been sort of a limitation on spreading panthers back up through Florida. Because the thing is, before our European ancestors arrived in Florida, the tin-headed Spaniards and so forth, panthers were all over the South. They roamed from Texas all the way over here to Florida and all the way up into Tennessee and so forth. And so it would be nice if panthers sort of got the run of other parts of Florida, since they are a state animal, rather than just being cooped up in that one corner of it.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, if a couple more questions we have a time for a few more. From Jennifer Sharp Wortham, the ones in captivity, do they breed?
Well, they tried to breed some in captivity and they did not succeed. The ones you see in captivity now are generally ones that were injured in the wild and can't live in the wild anymore. And so they're not being held there to breed. They're being held there because that's where they need to live to continue existing. So it's both a sad story and a good story too, that at least they're not, out there trying to fend for themselves. So one of the stories I tell in the book is about the skunk ape, which Florida has its own Bigfoot relative, a rather odoriferous creature known as the skunk ape. And there's a skunk ape research headquarters. It's actually, it's full of T-shirts with blurry pictures of this sort of ape-like creature. And they have a petting zoo, and something was going into the petting zoo and wiping out all the animals in there, and they suspected it was a panther. And so the people who own the skunk ape research headquarters campground set up a camera and tied up a goat outside. They literally had a scapegoat staked out, and sure enough, the panther attacked, and they got it on video, and then they got charged with animal cruelty for putting the goat in that position. The goat survived, by the way. And so the state wildlife people came in and captured the panther, and it wasn't this big, fierce creature. It was one that had been hit by a car and was so badly injured it couldn't hunt anymore. So it was taking advantage of having this, this petting zoo, sort of like the sort of like one of those cafeterias where you go through and you say, yeah, I'll have that one, I'll have that, and for him, it was a buffet, not a, not a petting zoo. So, so that's why that one wound up in captivity. And so they're living the life they can live, I guess is the way to put it. I know some people are troubled by seeing wild animals in captivity, but it's sort of the only life they can have at this point.
Here's a question about symbolism from Melissa Schwartz.
Okay.
And I'm going to read it. It just came in. I haven't read your Panther book yet because I'm reading your Oh, Florida book, which I'm loving, by the way.
Oh, good.
There's a lot of symbolism about seeing a panther, a lot of wonderful symbolism. Do you think that talking about that symbolism, beauty, grace, protection, would help to protect the panther instead of people thinking that the panther is just dangerous?
Yes. Yes. And that was why the school children naming it the state animal was such a significant thing, because it transformed it from this sort of scary animal into something that we could all be proud of and that we could hold up as an example of the best of Florida, because where you find panthers, you'll find wilderness. And Lord knows there's not nearly enough wilderness in Florida now as there used to be. But they're beautiful animals. They're sleek and elegant in their movements. And they generally want nothing to do with humans, so we really don't have much to fear from them. The people who freak out about them are people who have built houses or have bought houses in what used to be panther habitat, sort of on the edge of panther habitat, so that, the panthers, if they're looking for food, they might show up in your backyard and eat your chickens. But generally what they prefer to eat is white-tailed deer, feral hogs, so they're helping us out by eating the hogs because the hogs aren't supposed to be here, and they're very destructive. And so they're just a magnificent animal, and I think the more we can do to try and promote that idea, as opposed to, oh my God, we have panthers, is a good thing. That's why I'm happy to see all the license plates. It'd be easy to make fun of, the fact that we've got, more license plates than panthers, but the money from the license plate sales helps to pay for scientific research into the panthers. So that's a good thing. So, go buy those license plates, folks.
And we can close, I guess, it's a comment from Peter Rausch, but it's maybe something you want to comment on. I'm really glad.
Is it more about my wardrobe, I hope?
Well, it's complimentary. Okay.
Okay.
I'm really glad that you've retained a high profile in Florida environmental issues and politics reporting post the Times. Your robust, accurate, deep digging work is the model and the service that Florida citizens deserve and need. Thank you. And that's from Peter Rausch.
Wow. All right. Send me your bill later, Peter. Okay. No, I mean, I really, I'm really enjoying writing these columns for the Florida Phoenix, and sort of exploring some of the things that are going on around us. And I'm glad that people are interested in reading what I have to say about them. So thank you to all of you folks for doing that.
Well, and thank you all for coming tonight. I think we've come to the end of our questions, and thank you, Craig. It's good to see you again, even if it's not in person at the bookstore. But one of these days we'll get back to real life at the bookstore, I suppose.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, and good night to everybody.
Thank you.
Again, folks.